Well, hey, everybody, welcome to another CCA In Action podcast episode where we hear from real CCA clinicians and how they support our members every day. So far in this series, we've talked about the reactive kind of crisis interventions that EAPs do, but that's only really half the story. EAPs really need to be proactive in supporting people to maintain a high level of well-being. And I'm excited to be joined today by Alex Berger, who is a licensed clinical social worker as well as EAP counselor here at CCA. And she's going to share a story of how she does just that. But before we get to that story, Alex, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine. A happy Wednesday, right? Middle of the week.
Happy Wednesday for sure. And why don't you just tell everyone a little bit about what you do here at CCA?
Yeah, so thanks. I'm happy to be here. So like you said, I'm an EAP counselor. So that means we do short-term counseling. So I like to think of that as solution-focused, goal-oriented, really problem solving a specific issue in a short amount of time. And then if, we're talking and their issue is kind of more longer term in nature or has been ongoing, I can always refer them to a therapist, who takes their insurance, who might better suit, what they're going through.
Gotcha. And that's so crucial because just telling someone, hey, best of luck, go find another resource
Yeah,
typically is, a pretty big barrier to them wanting to continue care. So
for
I
sure.
love that last piece you added there.
Yeah.
But you had a story to share with us today. I'll just kind of sit back and let you take it away.
Yeah, so I mean, as an EAP counselor, we do wear many hats, right? So I do a lot of different things. But something that I see really, often in, my sessions are, workplace concerns, right? People are coming to me of, oh, I don't know how to communicate, right? With either my coworkers or with my boss, or I'm having, trouble interacting with someone. So that's kind of a little bit about the story I'm going to share today. So I had a member come to me who, is pretty high up, right? She's a director level, right? Has employees below her, has, multiple teams that she's in charge of. And she also obviously has her bosses above her, like we all do. And she was having a lot of trouble not knowing how to talk to her boss. Was like, I've been working with this person for a long time. But,
Mm.
she was having a different role, feeling like she couldn't express herself to her boss or not knowing how to get her point across. So I met her, right? The first thing I do is I always do an intake, right? So I ask her about why'd she come to the EAP, what's going on for her. And then I try to get a whole picture of a person. So I don't only ask them about their job and their role and the title going on, but I ask them about their different support systems, right? How do they take care of themselves? What goes on for them in a day to day to kind of understand what makes this person them. Um, so with that, right, we had, I think, up to about 6 sessions in total for this whole process, right? So I'm going to shorten down this process, when explaining it. But I asked her, how is she as a boss? What kind of feedback does she get from her employees? What does she like about being, in charge of people? What's easy for her? What's challenging for her? So we really started to hone in on that too, right? What feedback has she gotten from her employees that makes them want to come to her as a boss? So we've tried to
Gotcha.
focus on that positive aspect first, and then saying, okay, are there any positive interactions that you've had with your boss? What has worked, what hasn't worked in the past? Um, so we talked about that for a while, right? Kind of letting her go through different things at work, what comes easily, what comes harder for her. And then we talked about different communication strategies. So, if you go into an interaction already thinking it's going to be negative,
Yeah.
then right, then it's most likely not going to work
Yeah.
out.
It's like self-fulfilling prophecy.
For sure, right? So it's this idea of, okay, if you're already thinking my boss is not going to be receptive, he's not going to like what I have to say, or, we're not going to have a good dialogue about this, then why are you even having the conversation?
Yeah.
So we did a lot of reframing about how do I show up? How can I show up to conversations with my boss like I would for my employees that I show up, right? Having, a positive attitude when you show up to these conversations. Also, something that we did is talk about what's your goal, right? What do you want to get out of this conversation? If you could, we talk about, wave your magic wand and say, I'd want this conversation to go like this, what would you get out of these conversations? So we did a
I
little bit of,
love that.
yeah, yeah. A lot of space for her to vent, right? A lot of, just kind of reflecting on what she's saying. I summarize what she's saying always to make sure that I'm understanding her clearly. But really making sure I create a supportive environment in her sharing her story. Um, then the other thing that we did was talk about what does she have control over in this situation, right? Because she doesn't have control over what her boss says, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We wish, but we don't. But
That'd be nice, but yeah.
so it's what do you have control over in your situation, right? And so something I already talked about is our attitude going into it. But what are questions that I think of ahead of time? Again, something like what is my goal in this conversation? And then we did some role play, right? We did some different role plays to say, how could this go? How could that go, right? And any feelings that came up for her if something was frustrating, right? We would kind of take a pause and deal with that. Like, why is this frustrating or why would it not be frustrating? Or, kind of how does she advocate for herself and her employees to her boss?
So I love everything you're saying from the very beginning of, kind of how do you define yourself and what makes you, you. I love that phrase you used. And then the solution focused approach of let's focus on when it did go right. Let's
Yeah.
not dwell on all the times it didn't. So tell us, how did this end for the individual?
She well, she really liked it, right? She ended up going on, to ongoing counseling because I think she'd had been to therapy before, but hadn't been in a while. And I think something common in the EAP is a lot of psychoeducation, right?
Yeah.
About what is therapy, kind of defining therapy, getting someone involved in therapy or even their first experience. But for her, she had positive experience before, and this kind of made her remember why she had enjoyed therapy in the past.
Yeah.
But she did have some positive conversations with her boss as an outcome. I think she seemed to feel more confident going into it. And it was also about that, right? The confidence in herself to kind of lead and say,
Yeah.
I can do this.
I mean, that's so, I love this story because so many people think of EAP as, I used to do a lot of health fairs and I had so many people walk by and be like, oh, EAP, I'm not crazy. I don't need you. And it's like, this is a leadership tool. This is a
Yeah.
way to, better yourself, not just focus on depression or anxiety or stress. This is a way to improve communication and better yourself as a leader. So
Yeah.
I love this story you're sharing. And the work you're doing is so important because this leader is going to turn around and share her story of what it was like working with the EAP and that it's not scary and that it's not just severe mental health issues going on. So it sounds like you represented CCA really well with this member.
Yeah, I hope so. With everyone we try to, like I say to most of my clients, right? I'm happy and here to help you in any way that I can.
Yeah. Well, very cool. Well, Alex, we greatly appreciate your time today sharing this story with us. I think it highlights again the full breadth of how EAPs can help and moving just beyond this idea that it's reactive and crisis in nature. It's a huge component of it. But if an organization isn't utilizing it for leadership development or for helping people just figure out how they want to, move forward in their life, they're missing one of the most important components of an EAP.
Yeah, no, I definitely encourage anyone, even if they think, some people come to me and say, I have a really small problem. Like, that's actually what the EAP is perfect for,
Yeah,
right? We,
it really
we
is.
don't, we can't work on things that happen in your childhood, but we can try to work on something that's going on for you right now.
Yeah. Well, Alex, thank you again for your time today. Thank you for the work you do with our members. And I can't wait to have you back on for another episode sometime.
Yeah, anytime, Mark.
Well, thanks, Alex. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Stay tuned for our next episode next month. So until then, take care and be well, everybody.